to a very special episode of Grimlore, the Lore podcast for all your grim dark fantasy and sci-fi needs. I am Gerald, your dwarven tech host, because we have been brought in to the Lorehammer side of things in a very special crossover. We're going to be discussing the warp alongside my co-host Rayway and my other co-host Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This is great.
You're the binding glue that glues us all together, Gerald. How do you feel? How do you feel about being that special little guy of the group?
I don't know, but is that supposed to be a short joke?
From one dwarf to another, I'm allowed to make those kind of dwarves.
True, you are the you are the island dwarf in our tavern. So given we're kind of kitty cat. See, I'm already distracted.
That is a
nice cat. It's so lovely, I want to pet it.
Looks like a bat.
So, well, given well, hello there, Purge. So, before we get things started, I have a very special early Christmas present for you, dear listeners and Lorehammer goers. Give me just 1 second. Sorry, trying to remove these implants takes a little while. And here's that. Here's
it's a face reveal.
Okay. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Dad, it was you this whole time?
You said you'd be back. You said you'd be back from the shop 3 years ago.
I'm sorry. The milk we were trying to get was out of stock.
Ooh, yeah, go for some eggnog right now.
What a face reveal, though. Wow. Handsome boy.
Disconnect the implants.
Mm-hmm. I got to keep this in, though, so.
Fake ears.
All right. So the warp, everybody.
Oh, I love the warp.
Well, of course, we can't bring this up without...
all stuff that comes from it.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't bring up the warp without bringing up a classic Lorehammer. Think of it like an ocean.
Yeah. You want to go swimming in it, but chances are it'll kill you if you do. But it looks so inviting, so flashy, so glowy. It can make all things possible for you.
It's got little things swimming in it.
Little things and big things.
Here's something I'm going to let you guys know for the warp. If my voice doesn't, all the warps that I'm taking. I started eating it instead of snorting it, but that wasn't a good idea. I got some ideas for the warp that I want to share if I can, articulate it properly at a later point in this episode. It's got something to do with how time works with the warp and the concept of the gods and how the gods are related to one another. So that is something I'm interested to share with you guys for my theory on that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope your voice holds up, and maybe you got to start doing it anally and see what that does to you.
Try anything once.
Try anything once. May as well.
Yeah, let's not encourage some of our other patrons down at the tavern.
Yeah, not toasty, that's for sure.
Don't say his name 3 times. I don't want him summoned. So,
all right.
I guess before we get started, do we have any housekeeping that we want to do for either Grimlore or Lorehammer, or do we want to save that for the end?
I think everyone knows the drill. Join the Patreon of either show, but yeah, we can talk more about it at the end, I think.
All right,
I agree.
Sounds good. Well, I guess we'll. Fantastic. I guess without further ado, ladies and gents, mostly gents, we'll get right into it. Our warp crossover. Yeah, the
GrimLoreHammer warp crossover. What better way to get 2 groups of friends together than through the magic of the warp? The warp is a crazy thing. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Warhammer Fantasy and 40K and how the warp is a crucial part to both universes. But even though they have a lot of similarities, and lots of people think that the universes are connected, they're actually quite different. And the way the warp operates, well, once again, is quite similar. It's also the warp, so it has its own fucking mind, and it's gonna warp You can't stop the warp from warping. But let's jump into how would we define the warp? And the warp is a foundation concept in both Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy, serving as the chaotic underpinning of reality and the source of immense power and danger. Despite their shared name and similarities, the warp manifests and operates differently in each universe, shaping the narrative and setting in distinct ways. So let's start with like what the warp is more specifically in 40k. And in the grim darkness of the far future, the warp is a parallel dimension of psychic energy existing alongside the material universe. It is a rolling sea of raw emotion, thought, and potential. Within this immaterial realm, the psychic echoes of sentient beings' emotions coalesce, giving rise to vast storms of energy and even sentient entities such as demons and chaos gods themselves. The warp serves as a dual role in the Warhammer 40k setting. It is both a vital tool for interstellar travel and an existential threat to all life. Warp travel allows ships to cross vast distances of the galaxy by dipping into the turbulent dimension and re-emerging in a real space. However, this process is fraught with danger, as the warp is populated with malicious entities eager to possess or destroy anyone who dare enter their domain. Psychers, individuals with the ability to manipulate warp energy, act as conduits between the warp and real space, wielding immense power, but also exposing themselves to its corruptive influence.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So anybody who didn't know, well, there now you know.
Now you know. All right. Warhammer Fantasy time.
Let's do it.
All right. In Warhammer Fantasy, the warp is referred to as a realm of chaos. It exists as a metaphysical dimension beyond the physical world, but its boundaries are far more porous, allowing its influences to seep directly into the mortal realm. Unlike the vast galaxy-spanning nature of the 40k warp, the realm of chaos in fantasy is centered around the northern and southern poles of the world, where great rifts spill its energies into reality. Sorry. The realm of chaos is the source of magic in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. The winds of magic flow from this realm, permeating the world and enabling wizards, sorcerers, and other magic users to harness its power. However, this magic is inherently dangerous, as drawing upon the winds too greedily or without sufficient skill can lead to corruption, madness, or death. Ooh, throat sucks. The warp's presence is also deeply tied to the creation of chaos mutations and the rise of chaos worship among mortal followers, those who are drawn to its power despite its corruptive influence. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the warp is very interesting in both settings. It kind of acts as that magical option, that magical ability. You know, with D&D, it's a very different thing. They have gods, and the gods kind of give you power, or there's rituals that you can get power from, or you're born with it, and you can cast spells if you're like a sorcerer or stuff. It's kind of in your blood. But in 40k and fantasy, it is another dimension that you basically pull power from, and then you can channel it and harness it in real space. And you can harness it in a number of ways, whether it's, you know, this is a war game, so, you know, the obvious one would be shooting lightning bolts out your hand or casting fire. But it can also be used
meteors.
for dropping meteors on your enemies. Yeah, exactly. But in 40k, it can also be used for travel. It almost acts as like a wormhole where you enter it and then you pop out another spot without having to actually traverse space. It also acts as a way of communication in 40k, where there are people that can send messages across the vast distances of space through psychic messages. Instead of, you know, putting a ship in it, you put a message in a little warp wormhole and it shoots it out.
Awesome. Sorry, I was just making an quick adjustment to our notes here to account for Nurgle's blessings. I'm trying to put in the proper litanies to make sure we litanies and dwarven runes to make sure cover our asses on both ends, so to speak.
Yeah.
I pray to all the gods,
So.
even the gods who believe in atheism.
Huh. That's a
There are
conundrum. I like
atheist
it.
gods in Warhammer Fantasy.
So they have a shared yet unique concept. At its core, the warp in both Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy represent a chaotic, otherworldly force that reflects and amplifies the emotions, desires, and fears of sentient beings. It is a source of power, danger, and transformation, acting as the foundation for the Chaos Gods and their influence. However, its scale and interaction with the mortal world differ significantly between the two universes. In 40k, the warp is vast, intergalactic phenomenon that touches every corner of the galaxy, shapes the course of history and survival of civilizations. In contrast, the fantasy warp is more localized and intimate, deeply intertwined with the magic and mythos of the other world. This different in scope and integration creates unique challenges and storytelling opportunities in each setting, making the warp an endless, fascinating, and versatile concept. The foundation of understanding sets the stage for exploring the shared elements and key differences between the two interpretations of the warp. So here's maybe a question for you guys. Like, I am not as steeped in Warhammer Fantasy. I'm fantasy adjacent. I've picked up the odd book here and there. In Warhammer Fantasy, do they talk about other worlds at all? Or like when they look up into a night sky and they see stars, do they know anything about that?
That's a question for our elven friend here.
He's muted.
Uh-oh. Ray, you muted. Uh-oh. Nurgle
He's
giveth
muted.
and Nurgle taketh away.
Aha!
There we go.
I was on mute. I was muted. Damn you. Damn you, Vashdor. All right. So yes. In Warhammer Fantasy, it depends on where they are. In some cultures, they look at the stars and they're just like, oh, those are stars. But for some places, they're like, oh, there must be other worlds out there. It depends on where you're from. Like in Araby, they're a culture that's way more developed and culturally diverse. So their understanding of like the higher learnings is more advanced. In Age of Sigmar, however, there are other worlds. Those are the other realms. But in Age of Sigmar, they actually make
Yeah.
contact. In
But
Age of
Age of
Sigmar, they
Sigmar is
make
just full of
contact.
nonsense, so isn't it? That's what I've always been told. It's just a nonsense setting for
It's
nonsense people.
Well,
oh,
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here because in our albeit limited dabblings into Age of Sigmar for the Grimlore or the main Grimlore part, they do have some pretty interesting things, but it's how do I put this? It's like how a lot of the complaints I think comes from how it made the transition, just like a lot of people complain about the transitions from Firstborn to Primaris. So
Yeah, no, I could almost see AOS being fun in and of itself. Like, do I almost picture AOS as like all the planets are almost in the warp, where they have all these different planes of reality and you can jump between them. They're all connected, but you have to take like pathways. It's not like a physical plane where, fantasy, yeah, when you look up at those nighttime stars, they are actually stars. You could go there potentially if you had the technological advancement enough to get there. Where fantasy, it's like way more like all of it, including the world and the universe around them, is like a magical universe. When you leave your planet, you enter like an ether almost, as opposed to like space. Would that kind of be accurate?
From how they handled it, they basically retconned it. Where originally it was originally like you could go to another planet, and there was points where the Empire of Man was making rockets, like they were making fucking rockets, and I'm disappointed they didn't fucking have the Cold War with Kislev. Like, oh, we're gonna go to war with Kislev. First one to the moon gets it. But they basically retconned it by saying that when Warhammer Fantasy World exploded, um, for some reason, all the planes just ended. Like the planes are made of the fragments of the planet, and those planes also exist in space. Like not like they're like floating in space almost. but yet they're surrounded by like ethereal energy. So I'm not exactly sure where Age of Sigmar is placed, like cosmologically, like if it still operates in the same solar system as the planet was, or if it's like in the warp now. But my theory is that it's in the webway.
You're going many
Because,
levels deep into the spider web, are you? Many layers.
well, how they travel between realms is the same way that the Eldar used to use the webway. Like it's almost like identical.
It all goes back to the elves.
Okay.
Pointy-eared
We're
bastards.
the best. So
Yeah. Yeah, like
yeah, that's still debatable.
I feel like fantasy and 40K, the warp operates way more similar than, and just the way the universe in general operates is way more similar than with AOS. It's like a whole fucking new Pandora's box when you look under the hood of AOS and how it works.
And the comment that you just put up, put up from Purge about how it's like the world tree from Norse and Norse mythology and Magic the Gathering, that was kind of brought up during our. Was there a Seraphon episode, Ray? We kind of a lot of similarities there. Kind of makes it kind of sus, but so it's just it's its own beast.
I didn't compare it to the world tree. I compared it to the layers of Earth, like you know. Surface, mantle, crust, core.
Yep, you did. You did.
Interesting.
This is why you're the bard. So
I don't have my lute on me.
That's okay. We'll fix it in post.
My wife has a guitar.
There we go. Hey, see, it all works. It all comes together.
I only play the skin flute, unfortunately. But that's just me.
Okay, just about broke the dwarf here. All right. So let's talk about Slaanesh. Okay, we'll get to Slaanesh in just a second. Yeah.
Okay, I got topic. Slaanesh.
Oh no.
I got to talk about Slaanesh.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about when it gets here. So let's talk about what is shared between the warp in 40K and fantasy, and that includes the chaos gods. So fun fact, you can, if you didn't know, you can play chaos demons in either 40K or old world fantasy or AOS. So that's awesome. So chaos players for the win for once. The most striking similarity between the two settings is the shared pantheon of chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. These deities exist as a manifestation of mortal emotions, desires, and fears, making them both timeless and deeply tied to the action of mortals. Khorne, the god of blood and skulls, embodying rage, honor in battle, and a destructive thirst for violence. In both universes, Khorne's followers prioritize martial prowess and despise sorcery, viewing it as cowardly. His iconic battle cry, "Blood for the blood god! Skulls for the skull throne!" resonates across both realms, symbolizing this universal demand for slaughter. And among Grimlore's patrons is none other than our Khorne Croxagore Toasty. So shout out to you, good sir. Any thoughts on Khorne before we go to the next chaos demon or chaos god?
Yeah, pretty self-explanatory. That guy, give somebody a battle axe and set him loose on a planet, and chances are good that guy's a Khorne worshiper.
Pretty much. You see a lot of red and a lot of brass and a lot of blood. There you go.
I mean, Khorne actually does have sorcerers.
Oh yeah.
And,
so please explain to the Lorehammer listeners what he does to them.
He doesn't. Okay, it's not bad. It's not like he kills them. So Khorne does have sorcerers. And their job is to work the factories. So all the weapons and armor Khorne arms his soldiers with, his sorcerers imbue magic into. So the reason why Khorne's armor and weapons are so strong is because his sorcerers pour their magic into it.
Okay, interesting, cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they like to tie their magic to like physical objects then, as opposed to using it for like ethereal warp blast.
Yeah, they're like casting spells or shit. There's this kind of dwarfish almost, where it's like inscribe the runes into it, cut my wrist, fill the wounds with blood, and then hammer it in, and the blood seeps into the sword, and sword is now
Cool.
magic.
Nice.
Mhm.
Yeah, like in 40K they have the collars of Khorne, which are brass collars with spikes on them, and they will give you like anti-magic abilities, anti-warp abilities. But that's interesting how it's similar, but one is more defense and one is in fantasy. It's more attacking, like more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I brought this up too in that Grimlore episode where we talked about a little bit about Khorne. Was like, it seems kind of not hypocritical, but kind of odd because you have to rely on some kind of magic to be able to summon Khorne, use his power, but he despises sorcery. So,
Sure.
but I love the explanation that Ray had given. So, speaking of sorcery, now we get to talk about mine and Ray's favorite, Zinch, the changer
God.
of ways, representing ambition, manipulation, and the pursuit of knowledge. Zinch's influence in 40K is evident in the plotting of powerful psychers and warlords, while in fantasy, wizards and scholars often fall prey to his promises of power. His penchant for scheming and his ever-changing nature highlight his role as the ultimate architect of chaos. And back to the Grimlore Tavern, shout-outs to Magnus the Rad and Warper, our fellow Zinch boys.
So in fantasy, do they have a most powerful god, or is it kind of like 40K where it is constantly fluctuating who's kind of the most powerful? Because I could see like Chinch being the most powerful in fantasy very easily, just due to his nature. Where in 40K you have weapons and fucking volcano cannons and all these type of crazy things that would negate some magic. Where in fantasy, if you're shooting fireballs and dropping meteors, as you said, Ray, that's way more powerful than just imbuing an axe with some power. Or so what do you kind of think of that? Or do the gods vary in power level? Are they constantly shifting and flowing? Or
Okay, well, hang on, I'm not muted. Good, I'm not muted. Good. Just wanted to make sure I don't want to start like having a conversation and just not have anything to say. So for me, I think the Chaos Gods, their power is limited. It's not that they're stronger in 40K, it's that their power is being weakened. Because in Warhammer Fantasy, there is a whole pantheon of other gods that are actively competing against the Chaos Gods and depriving them of power. They're actively resisting them and preventing their influence on the mortal followers. Whereas in 40K, the Eldar, their gods, literally were like, nope, closing the door or out. Fuck you guys, right? Humans don't have a god if you want to count Big E, but Big E's not a god. And all the other like races don't really have gods to protect them. So the Chaos Gods are effectively unchecked in 40K.
okay, yeah,
Whereas
that's an
we
interesting way to
know
look at it.
faith, yeah. Whereas we know faith and devotion in both settings can stave off Chaos Gods. And like I said in Warhammer Fantasy, every human had better be a fucking Sigmar fearing follower because Sigmar is the baddest man of them all, and he is awesome. It's better to worship
Yeah.
Sigmar than a Chaos God.
One of my favorite parts that always got me with fantasy was Sigmar and how he had a bunch of different models for him, and you could follow his actual career progression from barbarian to noble king, and his armor would change, and eventually he's wearing this like scale clad armor, riding a horse and stuff, wielding the hammer. Very cool character for sure.
Yeah, he went through the whole tech tree.
For more
Yeah,
information,
exactly.
check out Grimlore episode 4.
The manliest man.
A man's man. All right. So let's talk about the chaos god that gave Rayway his affliction. Let's talk about Papa Nurgle, the plague father, who personifies decay, disease, and the acceptance of inevitability. Both in 40K and fantasy, his followers are marked by grotesque physical mutations and a paradoxical sense of joy in suffering. Nurgle offers his worshippers relief from fear and pain in exchange for their servitude, creating a twisted sense of comfort. And for our resident Nurgle boys, big shout out to Big Joe G and the Errant Plague Knight de las Rosas.
Turd.
What a name. Bird boys.
Well, he was
yeah,
literally made from Joe.
Ah,
That was a strange episode. We have a lot of
That was a
strange
great
episodes.
episode.
And they're all
That was
great
a great
episodes, but
episode.
they're also strange episodes. So
yeah, I would imagine Nurgle is pretty consistent in both how it's his representation in 40k and a fantasy.
Yeah, he's a pretty consistent guy.
oh yeah. All right, and let's talk about Rayway's other favorite chaos god. Apparently, is Slanesh, the Dark Prince of Pleasure, Indulgence, and Excess. Slanesh's followers are driven by the pursuit of perfection and sensory experiences. In 40k, this is often seen among hedonistic Emperor's Children Legion, while in fantasy, decadent cults and noble houses succumb to his allure. Despite the universe's difference, Slanesh's themes of obsession and overindulgence remain consistent. And with our Grimlore Tavern, we have the none other than the High Priest of Slanesh, Zane Leopard. Congratulations and shout out to you, good sir.
Nice. So here's like those are the big four that we can think of. You know, like you mentioned, Ray, there are other gods. Even in 40k, could be other entities that are chalked up as gods. I know at one point Slaanesh gets shafted, but I think he enjoyed it personally, and he gets removed from fantasy. Or did he just get removed from AOS? I'm not totally clear on the distinction of that.
So he got removed. She. I believe the proper pronunciation is Shem. I actually read one of the old codexes where they said the proper pronunciation for Slanesh isn't he or she, it's Shim. So Shim, Shim.
This is probably the
And
only time I'll respect somebody's pronouns, and for that, everyone else can get fucked.
those
But
are Slanesh's pronouns. Slanesh's pronouns are Shim. Yeah.
Shim.
So okay.
So what kind of happened to Slaanesh? Like, did he stay in fantasy the whole time, or did he get kind of bumped halfway through?
So he stayed in. So for Warhammer Fantasy, all the gods have always been there. So unlike 40k where Slanesh shows up later, in fantasy Slanesh has always been there. The gods have no origin in fantasy; they just always been there. In
Sure.
Age of
They're
Sigmar,
part of the
however,
creation of the universe, you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In Age of Sigmar, however, when the world ended, Slanesh consumed all the elven souls like she does in Age of Sigmar, or not in Age of Sigmar in Warhammer 40k. The problem was that when she ate, when they ate all the souls, this is gonna sound stupid because Age of Sigmar is a little stupid. She got indigestion, and she was too. She basically had a fucking Thanksgiving feast, was too full to fight back when Tyrion, Teclis, and who was the third god? Lariel, I think. Anyway, three elven gods, well, they were mortals and they became gods, team up and just start beating the shit out of Slanesh, and they free all the souls that she gorged herself on, and they trap her in a pocket dimension that exists between two realms in Age of Sigmar. So
Okay.
in Age of Sigmar, the realms, like I said, they're kind of like positioned like planets. Slanesh's pocket dimension prison is basically trapped between, like, let's say it's in the middle. On one side is the realm of light, Heish, and the realm of Ulgu, the realm of shadow. And these two realms, they orbit each other with Slanesh's realm stuck in the middle. And so
Okay.
almost like a gravity well, she's stuck between these two. She can never escape.
Huh. Yeah. Okay. And yeah, that kind of is a little more complicated. Like that adds a whole new element of what these gods are, and how they operate for sure.
They can get
But
full,
they can get full apparently of souls.
which is stupid. Which is that is so fucking dumb. I'm sorry, but that, like, The idea that Slanesh is just like, I'm gonna eat all the elven souls. No, oh, I can't move. Oh no, Tyrion Teclis, please don't. Blah, oh,
Yeah.
there goes all the elves. Just
Yeah,
like, oh, okay. I'm
it
being a little
seems so
hyperbolic,
like
but
they come up with this huge story arc just to only reverse it all in the same fucking time they
yeah,
write it. Like it'd be one thing if this was a whole big campaign book, but this was like the origins of AOS. This kind of happened all at one time.
yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Um,
Slaanesh is around in fantasy the whole time and is technically
Mhm.
still around in AOS, just trapped. Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
My next kind
She
of
does have
fantasy.
followers actively trying to free her in AOS as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. And so you can still play like Slaanesh demons and stuff, and that's how they get
Mhm.
around that. Okay.
Yeah,
mhm.
they're called the Hidden Knights of Slanesh.
Yeah.
My
Before
next
we
question.
go,
Yep.
I was going to say before we go further, we should probably maybe address a couple of the questions that are going on in the chat because apparently there is some confusion between Old World and AOS.
Oh shit, where are the
So
questions?
Purge, yeah. So what is the difference between AOS and Warhammer Fantasy? Are you able to answer this, or does your voice
Am
need
I
a
able to?
break?
Am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Okay.
You're not muted.
So this is Purge, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay. So here's what you need to know. Warhammer Fantasy was a single planet. They can see our visuals, right? I'm not just fucking making a design for no reason.
No, they can see
It was a
us.
single planet, and all the stories took place on the one planet. The thing was, though, is that over time, GW started losing money because the Tactical Marines box of Space Marines was selling more than the entire Warhammer Fantasy model line. Like a single kit of Space Marines was selling more than all of the old world's original sets. Now there was a bunch of reasons why that was poor marketing, poor balance, and a bunch of other shitty reasons. But regardless, GW had the brilliant idea to end the world. Like they were like, you know what, the world, we're losing money. Let's just send the world out with a bang. Let's have the end times happen. The end times was this thing that was supposed to happen for the longest time. And it was always like, 10 seconds to midnight. The world's going to end soon. And they did it. It was a horrible job. And about a year later, they went on to create Age of Sigmar, which was their way of creating a Warhammer-ified version of fantasy. Basically took all the things that people loved about Warhammer 40K, particularly the easier to paint factions like Space Marines and Stormcast. Their base is same. They were designed the same with the same intentions. The reason why Stormcast are the poster boy faction, and they just kind of just went from there. I don't know if they wrote the lore after, but with me saying that Slanesh threw up all the elven souls, you kind of get the idea that they were like, let's just write this after we push this out. And some of the rules from the first edition of Age of Sigmar were fucking gnarly. Like one of the rules I can remember reading was if you have a bigger mustache than your opponent, you succeed. Like mustache.
Yep.
If your
Yeah, they also
mustache,
did some like orc wog ones where if you yelled wog at your opponent, you'd get some bonuses and stuff.
yeah,
And yeah, they tried to make it way more like inviting for sure, and like almost like the rules were very simple. There was only like 3 stats for every character type thing, but yeah.
yes,
So yeah, basically they exploded Warhammer Fantasy, and then as you were kind of saying, they took those pieces of the old world and kind of created planes with them and a new setting.
yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
It makes sense in the lore, but me saying that they took parts of the planet and then they just made them float in space sounds a little bad. But just for brevity's sake, I don't want to go over the whole creation of Age of Sigmar again.
Yeah, like I think I think AOS is just its own creature, man. Like fantasy and 40K, they kind of make sense. They vibe together a lot better. AOS is its own brainchild, its own vibe. The way the warp operates, the way the universe operates, like I said, it's just its own thing.
It's very, mm, It's very different, but like not in a bad way, is how I put it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like fantasy was like just a grim dark fantasy setting, and it was tight. It was super cool, but it didn't really have anything unique about it beyond it being grim dark. You know,
Mhm. I
where
mean,
AOS it
it
does
was
have its own very unique kind of metaphysical things going on.
definitely, and from a modeling perspective too. What Ray was talking about with fantasy not selling well. If you look at a lot of the old fantasy models, mm, janky would be an understatement. Awkward and janky would be an understatement. But if you look at the AOS models, as much as we do like the shit on the lore sometimes, they are fucking beautiful. Like, I'm sorry, but
Hey,
they are fucking beautiful.
same can be said for Primaris Marines. You know, beautiful minis, horrible lore.
Like I kind of think what they were going for with the awkwardness of the lore is kind of like that Greek feel. Like if you ever read Greek mythology, it is like crazy sometimes. You're just like, how does that make sense? So I think that's the feel they were going for when they were writing it. Was like, let's let's just throw shit at the wall, and if it doesn't make sense, who cares? Which like I can appreciate, but it's still weird. You know,
Mhm.
Yeah.
it can still be weird sometimes.
Yeah, and like one thing too that I always even just consider when I'm doing like Lorehammer episodes, is you throw something out there, and then within 3 weeks, people aren't talking about that anymore. And you can get a vibe, and you can change, and you can adapt. And maybe they were just throwing out the very first iteration of AOS. Like, what does stick? What are people going to enjoy? What are people going to not like? And give it an edition, give it 2 editions, and people aren't even going to remember. Like, let's talk about Warhammer Rogue Trader first edition. Like, who the fuck knows what was going on in that wacky world, right? So it's
Mhm.
kind of one of those things. Throw some lore at the wall. Let's take bits that we find are being more successful. Not everything's going to stick, and adapt as we
Mhm.
go.
Yep, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ray, but isn't AOS in its third or fourth edition now? Fourth
Yeah.
edition. So yeah, and I've been to a few GW stores, and across both of them, several games of AOS are being played, and everyone's talked about how much they enjoyed it. So they,
Yeah.
as of their fourth edition, they must be doing something right. So
Yeah, for sure. They've definitely kind of nailed that in. And, as Ray was saying, they brought the Stormcast Eternals out, which I'm sure sells more than the rest of the other models in fantasy. They had a great design, kind of cool lore to them. Everyone wants to feel like a badass kind of warrior. So,
yeah,
um,
definitely.
the the next kind of god I had questions for. So we kind of learned what happened to Slaanesh. Definitely around in fantasy, kind of different in AOS. The Skaven god.
Hmm.
Um, Now, is the Skaven god around in both settings, or is that more of an AOS thing as well?
He's in both settings. He's in fantasy and Age of Sigmar. In Age of Sigmar, he becomes a proper god. In Warhammer, well, okay, that sounds a bad way of putting it, because all the gods are gods, but the Skaven god becomes the fifth Chaos god. Like
Yeah,
in Age of Sigmar, he is canonically the fifth Chaos god.
yeah,
And I've seen these funny memes where it's Be'lakor fighting Vashdor, and then it's two guys fighting in the background, and there's a guy smoking a joint in the foreground, and the guy smoking the joint in the foreground is the Great Horned Rat, and it says the Great Horned Rat, the actual fifth Chaos God.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so in fantasy, not fully a god, but maybe just a god to the rat people, to the
He's a
Skaven.
god of the Skaven, yeah.
Yeah, but not necessarily a god with the same powers and abilities as the other big four.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
okay.
then he
Or
So
becomes a Chaos
he would be
God.
more like the equivalent of like an Eldar god or a elven god then,
Yeah.
For
yeah,
Yeah.
that, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And
Then the next
while we're continuing our shout outs to Exo Flat Claw, Noble Arch Warlock, and current Tavern Bouncer. Here's your shout out. Be happy with it. And then
enjoy it, bitch.
one of our newest Discord members, Papa Dutch.
Oh,
So there y'all go.
okay. All right. So we'll keep going down the god train now that I'm kind of thinking about different gods. I know there was a god of death, and I know in AOS it definitely is the god of death. I forget what his name is. very Egyptian knockoff. He sucked a bunch of souls. He was the one who destroyed the old world. Maybe give me some context of him in AOS and fantasy.
Yes, fucking Nagash. Fucking
Nagash, yes, of course.
Nagash.
Of
Nagash
course.
is my favorite. Oh, all right, the biggest fucking asshole. Nagash is the best. Okay, so Nagash wasn't a god of death. Nagash was a mortal who joined a cult. I'm gonna summarize it as best I can. Nagash joined a wizard cult that wanted to find immortality. He ended up discovering necromancy from the Dark Elves. He ended up using a ritual to kill all the people in fantasy Egypt, basically, and raise them as the dead. He ends up getting betrayed by the Skaven because the Skaven were the good guys in that story, and he ends up failing. But Nagash is basically the Saturday morning cartoon villain, where he keeps coming back and getting defeated, but like he's almost like a Saturday morning villain, but he has the scale of Sauron. So like imagine if like every time a Saturday morning villain came in, he was like, "Oh, I'll get you this time, He-Man." Murders billions, and then he gets defeated and comes back next time and commits the same acts, but it's taken it's like the same degree of like stupidity. But the thing is that in the end times, one of the winds, which is what they needed to save the world, is the wind of death. These are basically schools of magic, and in order to control these winds of magic, they had to bind it to people. So Teclis got the no Teclis. Teclis got the one of light. Every single one was assigned a different wind of magic. Nagash was assigned death because he was the master of necromancy. Makes sense. He was assigned the one of necromancy. The thing is that when he got the powers, he killed all other gods of death because there was a bunch of other gods of death, including the humans god of death more. Nagash literally consumed the wind of death magic and then used that power to then consume all other gods of death across all other pantheons and consume their power into him. So originally there was like several gods of death for every religion. Now there's only one, and that god of death is Nagash.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, okay,
We
cool.
we have a running joke in the tavern that if there are 2 or 3 people that are always causing shit in the fantasy setting, it's either Nagash, Malekith from the Dark Elves, and maybe Marathi. And
I haven't heard that third name before. I was on your Dark Elves episode. I learned about that second guy you mentioned. It was super cool. His floating fortress ships and stuff that he was building, and yeah, very cool.
So to make this as family friendly as possible, Marathi is his mom, his teacher, and we'll say the cause of several Oedipus complexes.
Okay. So then I would have learned about her then.
That was old lore.
Old lore.
That was old lore.
Yeah. So I guess here's another big difference between, fantasy and 40K, where in fantasy it seems like there are many gods. Whether you're an Eldar god, whether you're one of these, the Rat god, the Nagash god. And it also seems like you can become a god. You can get more powerful. Where in 40K, there are only 4, maybe 5 if you want to get non-canonical and toss in Malal/Malice, but you don't actually. That's not canon. So that's like a big difference between the two, where in 40K, no one's becoming a chaos god. That's not how that system works. It's not how it operates. The Emperor is not becoming a chaos god. Vashtar is not becoming a chaos god. Be'lakor is not becoming a chaos god. Where in fantasy, all these things could be possible.
I also like to bring up too. I can't remember if this was discussed in an earlier Lorehammer episode, or I know I made mention of it on the Discord, but with how vast the warp is in the 40K setting, you could feasibly believe that there are other warp entities and maybe other warp gods possibly besides just the big 4 chaos gods. It's just they have the chaos moniker attached to them. So Vashtor could become a warp entity because that's technically what he is. Be'lakor could become a warp entity, but not necessarily belonging to the big 4.
Yeah, and one of the things that I kind of that's a great point, because even if you become like a demon prince, you start to get a mastery over the warp and stuff, and you can manifest your own realms and create stuff. But I feel like it's still always tied to one of the big 4.
Well,
like
you
the
usually get your
powers.
power from
Yeah,
one of the gods. Whereas
yeah,
like
hmm, yeah,
whereas becoming a god is like like a demon prince, you get your power from say corn. I'm a demon prince of corn. You don't
yeah,
Whereas like say in fantasy, it's I am Nagash, but I am such a powerful user of magic that I will become a god of death because I have such a dominance over magic of death.
yeah. No, that makes sense. Like you're able to harness that warp energy a little bit more. Yeah, yeah, cool. And the other big thing I feel like that defines the chaos gods is their ability to actually make demons. And maybe we'll jump back
Mhm.
into the notes here and carry on for a second about demons. In both settings, demons serve as the direct agents of the chaos gods, taking on physical forms in the mortal world. When summoned or through breaches in reality, their appearances are heavily influenced by the nature of the god they serve. Khorne's demons are brutal and warlike. Chinch's are ever shifting and surreal. Nurgles are bloated and diseased, and Slaanesh are lithe and unsettlingly beautiful. In Warhammer Fantasy, demons often materialize during warp rifts or when psychers inadvertently allow breaches. They are a constant threat to humanity and other species, emerging as harbingers of chaos invasions. In Warhammer Fantasy, demons are summoned by sorcerers or emerge during times of chaos incursion, such as the apocalyptic events of the end times. The influence of the winds of magic, closely tied to the realms of chaos, makes demons appear more localized, but no less catastrophic.
Just a quick side note. That was Warhammer 40K from the first blurb.
Ah,
Okay. All right. That
messed it
was all.
up.
That was all.
Mutations and corruptions. The transformative effects of the warp were another unifying features across the universes. Mortals exposed to the warp energy, risk physical and spiritual corruption, with mutations being a common outcome. These mutations can range from minor physical deformities to complete monstrosities, depending on the individual's exposure and the favor or disdain of the Chaos Gods. In 40K, this is often seen as the foundation of Chaos cults, where mortals willingly submit to corruption in exchange for power or forbidden knowledge. Chaos Space Marines, particularly those aligned with specific gods, also exhibit extensive mutations, such as tentacles, claws, and even entirely demon like forms. In fantasy, the influence of chaos is most visibly in the Northern Wastes, where prolonged exposure to the realms of chaos warps tribes into marauding bands and warriors of chaos and beastmen. These creatures are embodiments of unchecked mutation, bending humans and animal features into grotesque ways. So maybe here's kind of we've thrown out the realm of chaos moniker a couple of times now. Is that just another word for the warp, or is that like an actual physical location on their planet?
The realm of chaos is just their version of the warp. They didn't
Okay.
from what I understand, they didn't have the warp originally. Like it wasn't called the warp when warp because
Yeah.
Warhammer Fantasy began before 40K. They just called it the realm of chaos. It eventually
Okay.
became the warp as 40K became bigger.
Yeah. So I've heard like the Northern Wastes before in fantasy and how up there it's way more chaotic and way more able to be manipulated by the realm of chaos. Like what allows that? Is that kind of like, I go back to 40K, is that kind of like we have the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom where it's like the massive warp storm and there just happens to be a warp storm in the north of the planet that allows this kind of influence to happen there, or what's kind of the deal?
So that wasn't originally intended. So what happened was I'm gonna kind of go into the creation of the old world a little bit for everyone who wants to give comments. Um, I don't know if there's any clarification, feel free to ask them. But the old ones are in fantasy as well. For those who don't know, the old ones created life in 40K. The old ones created life on the Warhammer Fantasy world, and when they created it, they needed to reach the planet. So they created two. They're called polar gates, but they're webway portals. They are literally webway portals on the north and south pole. And what happened was they use these portals to reach the planet from all the other planets they had access to in this matrix. So they were extraterrestrial race that could travel between planets. And what happened was one day chaos decided to invade, and they broke down these polar gates on the North and South Pole.
Oh, the nerd will take his voice away.
Peppered, resources and everything, collapsed and became basically the equivalent to the Eye of Terror on the North and South Pole.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so there are distinct kind of, like you said, gates that are kind of open and broken down, and that kind of allows the warp to pour through in those.
Yeah.
So okay, yeah. So another very similar concept, just slightly different, but very, very similar to the Eye of Terror, the Maelstrom, or any other kind of warp incursion, warp anomaly.
And if you Lorehammer listeners want more context on what Ray was talking about, our second episode goes over the creation of the old world in a little bit more depth.
Very cool. Themes of enticement and downfall. A common narrative thread in both universes is how the warp tempts mortals with promises of power, knowledge, and freedom. The Chaos Gods exploit mortal weaknesses, be it fear, ambition, or desperation, leading to tragic downfalls. The allure of the warp is universal, appealing to individuals across all societies and species, highlighting a shared vulnerability of mortals in the face of chaos. So here's maybe another kind of slight difference. Well, we'll find out, actually. My understanding of fantasy is the Chaos Gods will try to get all races equally, where in 40k it definitely seems like they prefer fucking around with humans and using humans for their kind of hand in the material universe. Is that kind of similar in fantasy, where they have like a preferred race? Or
It depends on the god. So Slanesh, unlike in 40k where she automatically takes Eldar souls upon death, Slanesh has to who's the god of death for the elves? She has to try, she or he, Shim, they have to basically take the souls from the elven god of death. So while the elves can get their souls, there's a chance that Slanesh can take them. So Slanesh has a chance of taking their souls, and Slanesh has a chance of corrupting them. Whereas Khorne cannot he prefers not to, because Cain has his claws in the elves. Whereas Khorne Khorne can go to most races, except the Chaos Dwarves, I think, because the Chaos Dwarves have their own Chaos God, called Hashut, who we can cover at a later point, perhaps. And who else? Nurgle can go with anybody. And Zeech can go with anybody as well. I believe Zeech. Yeah.
So I just learned another Chaos God's name, and that's just building on that difference where, like, there are a lot of Chaos Gods in fantasy where it's not the same in 40k. Like, yeah, we have the Eldar gods, but we don't know what those actually are. You know, some people think they might be old ones. People think they might actually be some type of warp entity. Some people think they were just great legendary Eldar, and after 60 million years of mythos, they've been built up to a god status. So I think that's like, yeah, another really big kind of difference point between the two.
Yes. I should say when I say the Chaos Gods, like the 4 Chaos Gods, Khorne, Zeech, Slanesh, Nurgle, those are big G, capital G. Any other Chaos Gods are small G. Like they're still gods, but they aren't.
Yeah, but they still technically are gods, so to speak. Where, like, we could mention the Satan from 40k and people call them gods, but like they're so different. They're not even attached to the warp. So like they're like a completely different concept, where a lot of these gods in fantasy, they just seem like you said, lower G, lesser powered chaos gods, but they still kind of operate and function in that kind of realm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm arguing about just arguing with Purge always in the chat. So Purge really likes the idea of, I think, fantasy 40K, and I don't know how he feels about AOS, but probably I'm assuming AOS being kind of on this parallel universe, being slightly tied together and being connected in however way you want. You know, I don't think that's ever been the case. So I don't think that was ever their intention. And, you know, they've made it clear many times, GW, that they are not connected. Like GW said that many, many times.
And then they also write books where the Skaven talk to the Eldar.
Do they really?
Or mention
Yeah,
gets
there's
made of a silver armored warrior with a demon infused sword. Caldor Drago. So
now
cool.
here's how I look at that though. Like I look at that like like a little brother trying to be cool and fit in the big brother's universe when the big brothers doesn't even fucking recognize them. You know, it's a very one-sided directional relationship.
Force their way in.
Exactly. Because there's no references of fantasy in 40K. I can tell you that. Like, it's a very one-sided type of please let me be cool like you are.
There is actually one. There is actually one. The Skaven were originally no, not Skaven. The Sloth were originally meant to be the Skaven in 40K.
I think you mean the Hrud, technically.
Hrud, that's what it was. Sorry.
But,
Correct.
you know, we're talking Rogue Trader days, and back then they had
exactly.
female Space Marines, and Space Marines didn't even have Gene Seed back then. So, like, first edition, you can throw that into the crapshoot of just like we were talking earlier. They came out with something, they were seeing what kind of ideas stuck, and then by the time second came out, is a very different setting. Let's carry on with the notes. The key differences in the warp. Gerald, you want to take it away?
Sure. Let's talk about the nature of the warp next. So in 40K, the warp is an infinite, chaotic dimension parallel to real space, filled with psychic energy and the emotions of sentient beings. It is both a tool and a threat. Spacefaring civilizations rely on it for faster than light travel, navigating through the turbulent sea with psychic navigators and the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon powered by the Emperor of Mankind. The warp's vastness mirrors the scope of the galaxy itself, embodying the boundless scale of 40K. However, it is a hostile realm without protection such as Geller fields. Any contact risks madness, possession, or death, or worse. And the key trait with the warp in 40K is it serves as a cosmic level force immediately tied to the survival and expansion of the galaxy's factions. So basically, like, the Imperium relies on the warp for travel to keep its 1 million worlds function as a well-oiled machine. So when they lose their access to the warp, when they lose their access to the Astronomicon, if the Emperor dies or gets off the Golden Throne, then the Imperium is just completely,
Tell that to Dante and the Imperium Secundus.
Okay,
yes.
So with the warp rift, the side of the Imperium on the other side of the rift, away from Terra, is called the Imperium Nihilus or the Imperium Secundus. They are not connected to the Astronomicon, and they are not having a good time.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that not good time part.
It's a little iffy. It's definitely brings them down a star or two on the Yelp reviews.
Just a star, just one star.
Yeah, my table turned into a demon and walked off with my food. That's gonna lose a star on the Yelp review there.
Just another Tuesday.
Yeah.
So, Warhammer Fantasy. Let's talk about that. Known as the Realm of Chaos, the warp in fantasy is a more immediate, localized force. It is not a separate dimension spanning vast distances, but an ever-present threat at the borders of the mortal world. This realm exists beyond the northern and southern polar regions of the Old World, where the catastrophic collapse of the Old One's warp gates unleashed its corrupting energies. The magic of the fantasy world flows directly from this realm, influencing wizards, chaos sorcerers, and even the land itself. Unlike 40K, where the warp is tied to galactic travel and psychic abilities, in fantasy it is experienced as a tangible, omnipresent source of magic and power. Key trait: the warp in fantasy feels grounded and more personal, impacting the mortal plane directly without requiring interstellar context. And a big thing that you'll hear a lot about in fantasy, and especially with the Skaven, is warpstone, or the substance that our elven bard here loves to snort and huff all the livelong day.
I can stop whenever I want. It's not an addiction. I swear to God.
Tell that to the piles that you leave on the tavern floor. Damn, I have to sweep that up every day.
Oh, that's just a waste.
So yeah, warpstone is like that, kind of like how Wraithbone in 40k is like that solidified warp energy. That's the same thing with warpstone in the fantasy setting. So think of it like that. You can use it to amplify your magic powers. It causes a lot of mutations in humans, which leads to beastmen, if you know of that faction. And Skaven love warpstone. So,
Yeah, Skaven are the only faction that can actually make contact with it. Whereas every other faction, like, if a human touches it, they're going to get mutated or cancer. But Skaven are just like, ooh, shiny rock. I'm going to eat it.
Yeah. Is warpstone like a leftover residue? Like if a psychic casts a power, does like a little bit of warpstone kind of sprinkle off of it, and create kind of a residue of the power? Or is it more like an actual mineral that you mine and has been a part of the universe since the foundation, and is kind of like maybe a tether point isn't quite the right word, but more of like a natural phenomenon?
It's neither. It's not naturally occurring, nor does it come from wizards.
Okay.
So remember those polar gates when they exploded?
Yeah.
The debris from those polar gates, those fragments, were so suffused with warp energy that they became the warp stone, and they scattered across the planet around the equator. Like if you've ever
Cool.
seen like a meteor impact, how it explodes and it scatters, and every single piece it impacts continues to break apart into small and smaller fragments. Those scatter across the planet. On top
Okay,
of that,
cool.
any piece that was too big or was shot too high ended up actually orbiting the planet and eventually coalesce into the second moon called Moore's-Leap. So Warhammer
Whoa.
Fantasy has two moons, one a regular moon and one moon made out of warpstone. The
Okay,
warpstone
crazy.
moon is made out of the debris of the webway portals, and occasionally Moore's-Leap will drift closer to the planet. And because of how close they are, the planet's gravity will cause Moore's-Leap to become unstable and cause warpstone to rain down on the planet like a meteor shower.
Okay, wow. So it can constantly kind of refill the planet with warpstone, and like such a valuable resource that everyone probably fights for. And they're looking for the astrological signs of when this next kind of warpstone shower is going to happen, and then every army goes and tries to get some.
Yeah, one of the 40K, one of the skirmish games in fantasy, I think it's called Mordheim, is based on that. It's this massive rock of warpstone landed on this city, and all the play, like if you're playing the game, your job is just to go in there, grab warpstone, and fucking leave. Like you aren't
Nice.
the best fighters. You're like bandits, deadbeats. Your guys just trying to make quick cash, get into this town that got destroyed by a meteor shower, get the magic rock, and get out of there and fight anyone who's trying to get you.
Okay, interesting. Cool.
It's a very fun game.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the impact of the warp on technology and magic. In Warhammer 40k, the relationship between the warp and technology is often complex. Psykers channel the warp for abilities that often function like magic, but the technological framework of 40k adds a unique dimension. Devices like Gellerfield shields, ships during warp Gellerfield's shield ships during warp travels, while the Astronomicon enables navigation through turbulent tides. The Adeptus Mechanicus regards the warp as sacred and dangerous, integrating psychic phenomenon into their rituals and machinery. Chaos tainted technology, such as demon engines of the Chaos Space Marines, represent a darker, more insidious fusion of the warp and advanced tech. The warp's role in 40k is crucial element of technological progress, with its influence felt even in the most advanced and corrupt machinery. And like even bringing this to like the most kind of new and technological upstart, and kind of I don't want to say they'll have the best technology because they don't even come close to having the best technology, but the Tau, they're just on this verge of starting to implement some type of minor warp abilities into their starship jumping abilities themselves, when now they just skim the warp as opposed to they just ignored it altogether. So yeah, it's this unique fusion of technology and warp magic. So you kind of get this kind of both flavor. In Warhammer Fantasy, magic is the primary manifestation of the warp's influence, with the winds of magic flowing from the realms of chaos into the mortal world. Wizards learn to harness these winds, but doing so comes at great personal risk, as overstepping can lead to catastrophic results such as mutations, possession, or death. Unlike 40k, with technology mitigates the risk of the warp, fantasy magic users rely on skill, discipline, and sometimes sheer luck to avoid corruption. Chaos-infused artifacts and weapons, like those wielded by the Champions of Chaos, serve as equivalents to the demon engines of 40k, but are typically far rarer and tied to individuals rather than systems of war. The role in the warp in fantasy is a source of all magic and corruption, but its impact is contained within the realm of sorcery and physical manifestations. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, so like they have psychic hoods for Space Marines that will kind of be a psychic block for when you tap into the warp, where no type of things really exists like that in fantasy. Like I'm sure the Eldar or the elves have like some type of wards and stuff that must help, but
Yeah, they have runes embedded into like every bit of their clothing. On top of that, because of how long elves live, they put everything into their training. Like, let's say you want to cast Fireball. Well, let's say to cast Fireball, you have to say the word Fireball. Well, for an elf, they're not just going to say, "Oh, Fireball, I learned it." No, they're gonna be like Fireball, and they're gonna like break it down from the very letter to like as small as they can to get it as pinpoint perfect as possible. So while a human could learn like spell in like a couple weeks, it would take an elf years to master it. Then you might be thinking,
interesting.
oh well, why would it take so long for an elf to master it? It's not because an elf is like stupid or they just take so long to learn it. It's that for an elf, they have such a high standard compared to other races that it's going to take them significantly longer to learn a spell compared to humans.
Yeah. No, I think I get what you're saying. Like, yeah, for sure. They break it down just so much, and they make sure that each step along the way, breaking it down, they have to master. When I say my words, I skip over half of the fucking word when I read it, where they make sure they enunciate every word, every detail of it, and they don't pass forward before they do.
Yeah, or they might like enunciate like a specific letter of the word because they notice that when they enunciate that one word specifically, the fireball explodes this direction instead of this direction.
Cool. Yeah.
So when you're taking your high Gothic lessons with Trevor Buzak, maybe ask him about that.
I will bring that up with him, yes. How do I summon a fireball, and what word is best to enunciate?
Oh god, it's just a slur, isn't it?
The summary
Hang on,
differences. Yeah.
I gotta take a piss. Is that okay?
Yeah, we'll do some more reading and carry on.
Right, I'll be back in like 1 minute.
All right. I'm starting the clock.
Start the clock. The summary of differences. The warp in 40k is vast, cosmic, and deeply tied to the galactic scale of systems like travel and communication. The warp in fantasy is localized, directly influenced in the old world through magic and chaos, with less emphasis on technological interaction. In 40k, the warp is both a tool and a threat, mediated by psychers and technology, whereas in fantasy is an ever-present danger, accessed through magic and raw willpower. Yeah, very cool.
All right. Before we go into any kind of speculations, I think we missed a chunk of the notes with the mortals. So I guess while Ray's doing his thing, I'll go over that real quick. Relationship with mortals. In Warhammer 40k, the warp is largely viewed as an existential threat, with psychers serving as a bridge, and often a liability. Between real space and this malevolent realm, psychers draw their ability directly from the warp, allowing for incredible feats, but at a steep cost. Many civilizations, such as the Imperium and Man, regard the warp with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing it as a necessary evil. The Imperium employs psychers to maintain its empire, such as astropaths for communication, navigators for warp travel, etc., etc. But untrained psychers are hunted down, often sacrificed to the Emperor to maintain the Astronomicon. Chaos cults and heretical groups also interact with the warps, often seeking power through demon pacts or rituals that typically end in ruin. And I can say, as a player of the Dark Heresy tabletop, if you have a psyker in the group, make sure they don't form more than 4 demon packs.
Or just don't have them in your group at all, because you're always going to have them summon a demon, and it's probably going to be a demon prince, and it's probably going to wreck your party's day.
Okay, just a quick breakdown of what they had summoned. They had summoned, let me see here, a Lord of Change. They had summoned a Keeper of Secrets. They had summoned at least one other demonette of Slanesh, and then they summoned a... no. They married a daughter of a Nurgle demon.
Oh, yummy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
What kind of wedding is this?
Dark
Abomination.
Heresy. Dark Heresy. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that game, it's so tempting just to be like, I'm going to overcharge my psychic powers, and boom, Demon Prince. And you're like, fuck. Why'd you do that, Greg? Why? Every time.
Well, to put this into further context, this individual loves using the Bolt of Zinch, but the problem is, in my limited understanding of how the rules work, if you use something like Bolt of Zinch, you have to roll for Perils of the Warp. You get a certain number, that's where you summon your Lords of Change and your Keepers of Secrets.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's a little bit of Dark Heresy for you. Maybe that could be a future Lorehammer episode at some point if we get to that. Okay. So the warp in Warhammer Fantasy, mortals interact with the warp primarily through magic, which is drawn directly from the realm of chaos. Wizards and sorcerers risk corruption with every spell they cast, and chaos worshippers actively seek power from the gods of the warp, often reshaping themselves into grotesque forms. The warp is viewed with awe and terror by those who understand its nature, while many mortals are simply ignorant of its full implications. Unlike in 40k, where the warp is often mediated through technology or institutions, fantasy mortals have a rawer, more direct connection to its power. The corruption is more physical and visible, as seen in the twisted forms of chaos mutants and beastmen. So the unique dynamic is the fantasy warp is a more direct and immediate force with fewer barriers between mortals and its corrupting influence.
Yeah, I just keep getting this picture. Well, I don't get this picture. It's hard to picture the warp, but yeah, it's just this like localized version versus 40k where it's like way more grand, way more all-encompassing and tied to everything. Yeah, where way more direct and distinct in fantasy, and way more coverage.
And what
anyone can be corrupted in fantasy is just, I think in 40k, chaos has a more dominating presence.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about the technology and stuff with the warp, Purge did make a good quote from Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. That's a great quote, man. Like, great quote. All right. Speaking of Purge, you're going to like this. We're talking speculative connections now between the two. So we'll lay it out here for you, Purge. I'll actually entertain the idea of connecting them instead of just kicking your ideas down. While the Warhammer Fantasy and 40k settings are distinct and separate universes, there has been a lot of fan speculations about the potential links between the two, particularly regarding the warp and chaos. This section explores some of those theories that suggest both warps might be connected, or at the very least share common origins or influences. So the first theory is the shared warp. Some fans speculate that the warps of 40k and fantasy are not entirely separate, but part of a broader interconnected multiverse. This theory points that the warp in 40k could be an evolved or more fully realized version of the fantasy warp. The ideas of the realm of chaos as seen in fantasy might have grown or transformed over time into a much larger and more complex 40k warp. This transformation could have been caused by immense psychic powers unleashed during the fall of humanity, the rise of the Imperium, or even the gradual decay of the evolution of the Chaos Gods themselves. One of the elements of this theory is the idea that the warp is shaped by the collective psyche of emotional energy of sentient beings. In fantasy, the warp is still deeply tied to the mortal world, with gods and mortal magic inextricably linked. However, in 40k, the warp has become far more chaotic, dangerous, and vast, perhaps as a result of millennia of psychic and cosmic conflicts that have escalated the warp's power. This difference could be seen as natural progression, or even a split between the two warps as humanity's psyche continues to warp and fracture. Interesting. Yeah. So this is just kind of as time kind of progresses, it just kind of, we impart more of ourselves onto it. So it gets more fucking
Messed up.
Exactly. As mortals interact with it more and more, it becomes less of this thing that you interact with it. In fantasy, like it kind of interacts with you. It's always kind of tempting you. You kind of interact with it and cause your will upon it.
I'm not sure if now would be a good point to share my theory for how I think the two worlds are connected, or like how the warp functions, like how I see the warp functioning.
Yeah, right now is perfect. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, perfect.
We're in the theory craft. And
okay, so how do I want to put this? It's hard to explain. Okay, so the warp, for what I think, is that there is no realm of chaos. Like there isn't like there isn't like a dark alley in the warp where it's like that's where the chaos gods go. Don't go over there. For me, I think that the warp is like, it's like, fuck, I don't want to put this, because it's like it's a string theory, and I don't know how much you guys understand what string theory.
perfectly,
but
all of it. I am known to be a geneticist. Many scientific degrees I've been given over the years. So yeah, string theory's on there.
You're a xenobiologist, after all.
Yeah, there's another one of them.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So basically, you have the warp, which is like just the basic warp, and then every single Chaos God's realm is their own like filter of the chaos of warp. So for example, so like you have the warp, and then you have Nurgle's version of the warp. You have Korn's version of the warp, Snesh's version of the warp, and Zeech's version of the warp. And all these versions of the warp, they all exist in the same space, but they don't exist in the same dimension. So like similar to like a room that can have like this room could be like my room, your room, and Gerald's room, but none of us occupy the room at the same time. So when I go in, it's my room, but when I leave and Gerald goes in, it's his room. And when you go in, Mark, it's your room. But there could be a point where, let's say me and Gerald go in at the same time. Well, now this room becomes mine and his room. So now they have to compete with each other to see which room takes dominance. I think that's how the warp works, but I also think that's how it works on a galactic level. Because I think, because in Warhammer Fantasy and in 40k, Zeech was stated to be the strongest Chaos God, and it took all three Chaos Gods to beat him. But the problem is you can't have the three Chaos Gods beat Zeech in Warhammer 40k if Slaanesh was only created after the Eldar brought her into existence. So my idea is that the Chaos Gods, like chaos itself, has its own like separate timeline, its own separate history. And when a Chaos God gains access to a setting or a dimension, they bring their history with it. And they bring their effect on the collective history together. So, for example, let's say we were all Chaos Gods. Let's say we were going to invade 40k. Let's say me and Gerald. Let's say the three of us. We fought each other in Warhammer Fantasy, and like me and Gerald kicked the shit out of Mark in Warhammer Fantasy, and then we end up invading 40k. Well, let's say I don't know. All the Trevor Buzaks commit a bunch of racial slurs and bring Mark into existence. Because Mark is brought into existence in the 40k universe, but because he has history with us in fantasy, that fantasy's history gets brought into 40K, which ends up creating this like really weird like time thing. And what I think when people say the deep warp, that isn't like, oh, the deep warp is where things strung in the chaos gods live. I think the deep warp is where the other like chaos beings live, and the other chaos gods are trying to keep those things out because they're trying to maintain their monopoly on 40K. Because we see in Warhammer Fantasy, there's way more chaos gods, and the chaos gods have way less influence in fantasy compared to 40K, where there's only four.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, and I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it. And the way I'm trying to wrap my mind around it is, we talk about the warp being in 40K. It's universal. It's in other galaxies, and then the question becomes like, what is Khorne like in the galaxy over? What is Slaanesh like in the galaxy over? And it's almost like, they have a foothold, a stronghold in our galaxy, and over in another one, maybe there might be another powerful god, but 4 of them are trying to keep that out. But that can almost be applied to Warhammer Fantasy as well, where it's like, there are some that have control over it, and they're trying to keep other ones out in this kind of, but it's still all kind of connected. Is that kind of an easier breakdown of it, or a simple kind of concept for me to grasp?
I would say
Kinda
so,
co-
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting one. Like, the warp operates very much based on like who is putting the emotions to it, and like you can have a very distinct impact on it for sure. So yeah, there I could see how that would kind of work,
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why I came up with that theory is because for those
Oh, Vastar's mad at him again.
Oh, sweet Vashtar.
Praise be the Omnissiah, the Dark Omnissiah.
silence me. GW is trying to silence me. GW steals from a lot of IPs, and one of the series that inspired Warhammer was the Elric of Melibene series, fantastic series. And in that series, there are chaos gods in that series. Even the 8-pointed star of chaos originates in that series. Like the 8-pointed star comes from that series. Even the Meliboneans are basically the Jukari. Well, the
Huh.
Jukari, they're dark elves. So there's a lot of inspiration there. They even have battle barges, just not in space. There's a lot.
Interesting.
It's a
Okay.
lot. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun inspiration, and they make a similar kind of like similar to how I was explaining it. They make a similar kind of analogy, and I was kind of like, that's kind of how it works in 40K almost compared to fantasy.
Interesting. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I don't mind that one. I'm always going to die on the bridge that they're separate, but I can get behind it. It's better than some of the kooky, wacky ideas of how they're connected that I've heard.
Yeah, I mean,
String
I
theory.
appreciate the string theory, man. Bazinga!
Gerald, you didn't take your bath. What the hell?
I'm sorry. I was looking for some very specific scented sacred oils.
WD-40, while is one of the finest of oils, is not the finest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And only the best for the Omnissiah.
Yeah. Do we want to jump to the next kind of theory that's often circulating around?
Yeah.
Or do you have? Yeah. So chaos as a universal force. Another theory is that both warps are manifestations of the same underlying universal force. Chaos, which exists outside of both the 40K and fantasy realities. This would mean that the chaos gods themselves might be a constant in the fabric of the multiverse, merely appearing differently in each universe. While they manifest as similar figures of Khorne, Sheen, Schnurgle, and Slaanesh in both realms, the forms they take and the way they interact with the mortals can vary drastically due to the differing rules and themes of each universe. In 40K, chaos is almost constant presence in every aspect of the universe, whether it's through the corrupting influence of humanity, the rise of heretic factions, and all the encompassing threat of the warp during interstellar travel. In contrast, in fantasy, chaos is more localized, but still serves as a pervading, insidious influence. In fantasy universe, the chaos gods focus more on direct conflict with the human kingdoms and races, attempting to bring about the old world, an end to the old world. The differences in how the Chaos Gods influence mortals could be the result of the powers being constrained by the different laws of reality in each setting. So yeah, that one's an interesting one. I almost buy into this one the most, if anything, where it's just, I am the same person, but I can go play basketball and I can go play soccer, and the rules that I use when I do either one of those games are very different. Even though my body, my abilities, I can still jump the same height, but now, I just interact differently because there are different rules on the setting. So that one
You
I think
also
is
technically are a different person because like you were the different team too.
Sure, and you're slightly different, and I'm very similar, but in one I'm wearing a red jersey, and the other one I'm wearing a blue jersey. Yeah, that one's pretty easy to kind of grasp. Just kind of the universal force, and it has different operating rules in different universes.
Sorry, I'm trying to look for a reel that a friend of mine had sent me a while back. I can't find it, but I can basically summarize. This is another theory about the warp, more so towards the towards 40K, but it basically went that because chaos demons existed before humanity, if we're going the route of the war in heaven, one could argue because they're bipedal, or because a lot of the demons are more or less bipedal and have a humanoid shape, you can infer that as the main dominant faction in the galaxy at that time during the war in heaven, you could argue that the Necrontyr played a huge part in feeding the warp with everything it did, and then what they did with the Satan and everything. And so there was a theory that like a lot of the chaos demons are a lot more, could be more reminiscent of what a Necrontyr might look like, as opposed to the robot skeletons. It was meant as like a meme and a joke, but it was still like interesting enough that like I gotta bring that point up.
Hey, when talking about the warp, almost all things are valid.
Exactly. But now that we're talking about with chaos demons, you also got their gods. So how do the chaos gods? What is their role with all of this, and how does that affect their followers? The connection between the two warps is also speculated to lie in the way the chaos gods are worshipped and how their demonic legions manifest. In both settings, the gods have mortal followers, cultists, and sorcerers who channel the power of the warp, but the relationship to the gods differs slightly between universes. In 40K, the warp is a constant battleground where the power of chaos is mostly fought over by the forces of the Immaterium and other factions, whereas in fantasy, the gods of chaos are more directly involved in the mortal world, especially through chaos incursions and invasions in the old world. In Warhammer Fantasy, the Chaos Gods are often worshipped by mortals who are closer to the physical world. This makes their influence seem more immediate and tangible, as followers of Chaos might actively summon demons, invoke magic spells, or engage in ritualistic sacrifices. In 40K, the gods and their followers, while similarly devoted, are more dispersed throughout the galaxy. The sheer scale of the 40K setting means that chaos influence is far more subtle, but just as dangerous. There are fan theories that the evolution of the Chaos Gods and their followers in 40K reflects a post-apocalyptic shift that began in the fantasy universe when the forces of chaos were just beginning to warp reality.
Yeah, so that kind of really drives back home that like localization concept of them, where fantasy is just so much more localized. Yeah. And the next little connection point, but before we get to it, I'm going to drop a invite link in the chat for anyone who wants to join us. Drop your crazy, wacky theory about these topics. But we'll talk about the temporal connection. Is fantasy a precursor to 40K? Some fans have speculated that Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40K could exist on a continuum. Ooh, another big fancy word that I've read and heard of, but have no idea what it truly means. With the events of fantasy setting taking place far earlier in the timeline than 40K. Under this theory, the Warhammer Fantasy universe might be an earlier version of the 40K universe, one that has since collapsed, perhaps due to the rise of chaos or an event akin to the end times. This could explain why the warp in fantasy seems more closely tied to the physical world, while in 40k it's entirely separate dimension, completely alien and ever encroaching on reality. This idea connects the notion that the warp is timeless, meaning that both warps could be at different stages of the same chaotic energy in the broader multiverse. And the fantasy universe represents an earlier, less advanced version of 40k timeline. In this scenario, the fall of the old world could be viewed as a catalyst for the formation of the 40k universe and the creation of a more evolved warp. A shift from the purely magical to the more physically driven. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Just on the thought of even timelines and stuff, another kind of thought is, fantasy, the world of old world or whatever, is just a random planet in the Imperium. Lots of people like to think that Sigmar is a fallen Primarch or whatever, and that's why he was able to do such things. That's why he was so much bigger. So it's on the same timeline, but just once again, it just goes back to fantasy being way more localized, as opposed to just the broad scheme of it all. And the planet could be, cut off by warp storms and all that kind of stuff, and never really gets access to the main 40k operating theater. So,
well, that was
it's
my
just
main
Age of
hang-up.
Sigmar throws a wrench in that theory.
It throws a wrench in a lot of things, apparently.
Yeah, and that's why
That
we
wa-
never consider it when talking to other humans.
The tavern will give us some lip service whenever it's warranted. But that was my main hang up when they were talking about like war fantasy being like the precursor or like the prequel to 40k, was like just the existence of Slaanesh. That was the big thing for me. It was just like, how can Slaanesh have always been around, but he, she, they were only very recent in terms of 40k? So it basically had to, the fantasy setting, if that was the case, if we were to take that at face value, the fantasy setting would have to exist somewhere in the 40k or the 30k galaxy, I guess, but still only operate on such a very feudal but magical fantasy technological level. But that is just a lot of things are possible in 40k, but I mean that still stretches my belief.
Hang on.
My belief.
Okay. Hang on. Okay, grim foil hat theory here going on here, okay? Okay. So we know that the elves trapped Slaanesh in the eclipse dimension between the light and dark worlds. What if they keep her isolated long enough that belief and awareness of Slaanesh fades into obscurity, so she no longer is like worshipped, and because she no longer is worshipped, she fades from reality and basically leaves the setting. Only
Bastor is not pleased.
Yeah, clearly your idea was not good if it cut you out. The internet did not want to be told what you were spilling.
No. I personally believe that fantasy takes place after 40k, but you know.
Oh man, now that one I haven't fucking heard before. Now ain't that a plot twist? After the end times of 40k fantasy happens. My God. What'd you call it? Grimfoil hat theory?
Foil hat theory. Well, no, Sigmar is a star child, okay? Sigmar is a star child because when he was born, there was a comet, a two-tailed comet. That's a falling star that was flowing overhead when he was born. Then he was such a Chad, he killed so many people. He was amazing and he became a god. If anything, that sounds like a star child to me.
To quote one of our patrons, Flub, he was a dude that was such a dude, he became a god.
Dude.
Dude, I'm such a dude. I became a god.
Dude.
What is this?
Yeah. Very
It's
cool.
Warpstone. Dude.
The one thing I'll kind of say about the warp 2 and time in the warp, because it's a weird thing, man. Like, it doesn't operate at the same time we do. Time is just a construct, as they say. But like, once something happens in the warp, it happens all across the warp. It doesn't operate on that same time zone. So when Slaanesh was born in 40k, that doesn't mean that it wasn't then around in the beginning of time for the warp. Like, just because of time fuckery and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where my theory comes in. Is like basically the warp is like outside of time, so everything is always happening. But when it comes into a setting, it basically they basically try to like take this thing that is always happening, and they try to put it into a timeline for it to make sense in the setting. So like we said, we know that the Chaos Gods go to war. We know Zeech was the most powerful at one point. We know Slaanesh was the youngest, was the latest.
Slaanesh giveth and Slaanesh taketh away, apparently.
That's the way she goes.
She wants that elf soul, man.
Cool. Yeah. I wonder how much of that we got recorded just because it records you locally, so it doesn't matter that your internet drops. So we probably still got exactly what you said, and we'll now have me and Gerald will have to listen to the podcast to know what you said.
It's dying a little bit at the end.
My final thought before we go to purge in the call-in section here is I often look at the universe in two different ways. You got like your horizontal plane and you got your vertical plane, and your vertical plane is different dimensions. You know, we're in the third dimension. You go up, you're in the fourth dimension. You go up, fifth dimension. The fourth dimension is timeless. We think that like the God of the Christian Bible potentially could be like a fourth dimensional being who is timeless, or maybe even higher than that, whatever. But then we also have the vertical plane, and that's more like, the Marvel alternate universes. And the farther you go on that horizontal plane, the more it differs from us, where, one realm over, one parallel universe over, I have black hair, and then the next one over, I have 3 arms, and the next one over, it just gets crazier and crazier and crazier. So yeah, when we're talking about the warp, I think it's more of that vertical up and down. It's a dimensional thing as opposed to the horizontal alternate reality thing, because it operates in different. It operates with different rules as opposed to it just being slightly different. It has different rules. It's timeless. I listened to this one podcast about the 13 kind of talked about dimensions or whatever that scientists are kind of going on, and it's way above my fucking pay grade to kind of dumb down, but that's kind of how I look at the warp. It's definitely on that vertical, where the more you get on it, you get different, you can see different things, you can see past, present, future, and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to just being, oh, Mark's now black-haired on that horizontal. In one alternate universe, I can say the N-word, but not in this one, unfortunately.
I don't normally shill for other lore tubers and other podcasters or whatnot, but in regards to this whole time continuum thing, string theory, where we're talking about chaos theory, there's also, it's on the tip of my tongue, what's the thing I'm thinking of? Causality. Luton, very famous lore tuber for 40k, has a very extensive video library about this very thing. So if you're interested in what the three of us idiots were talking about, go over to his videos, and he can give you an infinitely better explanation than what we could. So shout out to Luton. Come on to Lorehammer and or Grimlore if you hear this.
Yeah, fucking would love that. And hey, if you listen to this and you also listen to Luton, and maybe you've been DMing the dude, and maybe that dude actually responded to you, tell him to come on our show. I'd love to have him on. I often get told I should have this guest on and this guest on, being like one of the biggest 40k podcasts. The problem is nobody answers their DMs when I message them. So if you're already messaging, that's how I got Graham McNeil. I didn't reach out to him. Some dude was already messaging a dude, and then that dude messaged me. So that's the way to do that kind of crossover. But we'd love it, man. Like these crossover episodes, the GrimLoreHammer crossover has been fantastic. And with that, I think we're ready to go to call-ins. We'll give Purge a second here to kind of get his stuff together. And hey, Purge, welcome to the show.
Literally a second to get it together there, huh?
Yeah, get it together, my man.
You.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, boys. How's it going tonight?
Howdy.
Perfect.
I'm
So,
sick.
well, hopefully you get better because being sick sucks at this time of year. But
Hey, he's been blessed by Nurgle. You don't wish that blessing upon him or take that blessing away from him.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Enjoy that blessing then. My correction. My thought process though is the Warhammer, original Warhammer fantasy would be like the starting of the entire, if you want to call it the multiverse. And then we get to the point where the Warhammer world gets destroyed, and then we get AOS. But then the other splitting timeline would then be eventually going to Warhammer 40K. And like they don't mention much of the original Warhammer world, but in the same thing with our modern history, like our history is like 6,000 years old, but Homo sapiens are like 40,000 years old. So what happened during that 30,000 years that we have no idea about? And there could have been advanced civilizations that built up over that time, and we would have never known, because we know if humanity died off tomorrow, the Earth would reclaim everything within a couple thousand years. So it's easy for there to be advanced civilizations that just died off. And even when we talk about things like elves, or what's usually called Siddhi in folklore, like we have actual folklore about elves being part of human history. It's considered fantasy and not real, but who's not to say that maybe 30,000 years ago there was actual elves that were working with humans at one time, and because we killed them all off, now like, oh, now it's just a fantasy creature that we just made up.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I often talk about that in 40K, like 10,000 years from 40K to 30K. That's an incomprehensible amount of time for us. And just like going back 40,000 years in our history, like what would it have been like? Now, I do believe that we have progressed as humans the farthest that we ever have in this current go round, just due to that we have satellites, and otherwise we would see satellites from previous civilizations. But technology trees operate so fucking fun. Like they could have way higher technology than us. Like maybe they've learned how to lift heavy blocks up to build the pyramid through gravity waves, and that technology has been lost. But it's a different branch where we went down gasoline and fossil fuels. They went down a different branch of technology to harness it. Such a cool thought and such a cool concept of what the fuck happened 40,000 years ago. I think even humans now have been traced back to 120,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like it goes back far.
Yeah, and like I said, there's so much stuff that could have happened. And like when you're talking about satellites, there is the Black Knight satellite in space that we know.
I've heard of that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So, and then they said Atlantis used crystals for their power, and like we're starting to realize that even for just normal electronics, we're starting to use like artificial crystals to help them out and stuff. So who knows what benefits is there, right?
Yeah.
And then
yep. Sorry.
I was gonna say with Gerald's point about the chaos gods in 40K are created in the modern setting, where in Warhammer they've been around the entire time. Well, going back to with that divergence in the timeline, like they've been around the entire time, but when that timeline diverged, they were recreated, for lack of a way to put it. So that's why in 40K we see them being created during human history, even though arguably they've always been around if we go to their original timeline.
Sure.
I'm going to be honest. That I will not be upset if you jump down my throat, Mark. That part of 40K old lore, I never sat well with me. Like, why would you have 3 of the big 4 chaos gods being fully created and born from like our Middle Ages, Renaissance, blah, 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 and not have some kind of cataclysmic event happen to humanity on one planet, mind you? And just like Mark pointed out in a previous episode of Lorehammer, it took the Eldar 60 million years of debauchery across the entire galaxy to birth Slaanesh. That was the one thing that never really settled well with me, even though, yes, technically, like, if you want to look at that viewpoint, all the Chaos Gods existed. It was just like, I don't know. I have a hard time wrapping my brain around that. So if our resident 40K vet has a better explanation for that, I am all for hearing it.
Yeah, I didn't write any of this, so
You've
Just
been in it
working with the
longer
tools
than
we've been given.
yeah.
You've been in it
Yeah,
longer
and-
than the rest of us, so
Yeah, and like to be honest, like that part of the lore that I got that from came from the Realm of Chaos books, and that's very old lore. You know, that's almost in between first edition and second edition. So, you know, its validity is very questionable. Like
There's
I'm not
also
married
stuff
to
about
that idea.
fantasy in there too, but in the Realm of Chaos book.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly it. So while I definitely don't hold to that by any means, it's just another kind of viewpoint, and sometimes it gets brought up by me a lot.
And I
every day.
agree, it doesn't make sense. But like I said, working with the tools we've been given, if we go with that whole fractured timeline, then yeah, the Chaos Gods always existed, but they didn't exist in that new timeline until that timeline fractured. And why are they so interested in humanity? Well, humanity plays this big role then in this fractured timeline, where prior to that fractured timeline, everybody was playing a role in it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Man,
buy
this
into
is
that a
hurting
little
my
bit more.
brain. I love it.
I had to break up with the ex because of that. I talked to her about stuff, and she's like, "You make my brain hurt." And it's like, obviously, you're not the right one for me if I can't even have a conversation with you about stuff.
Yeah. So either you're
Oh.
dumb or yeah.
I didn't
no,
say it that way. I just said, I think I'll find someone else and I'll stop making your brain hurt.
no love
Oh.
lost there.
I thought the argument was that she liked Tao.
That was his other girlfriend.
Yeah, no. That was a
He's a
different
man
one.
of many women. He's broken up with many women over 40K related issues.
Yeah, there we go. It was all 40K related. We'll go with that as the main theory.
All
Yeah.
is Warhammer.
Yeah, the fan theory.
Warhammer all the way down for sure.
Where
Yeah,
fan
man.
canon is, where fan canon is the only true canon.
Yeah, where you too can put on your Grim tinfoil hat. Grim tin hat.
I mean, it's always fun
Grim foil hat.
trying to push the lore to as far as you can. Like I said, certain things are just not possible, but there's certain things that are taboo that you can play with.
Yeah, man. And often in those little areas, you find the best stories or the most interesting things for sure.
And on that note, everyone should listen to Lorehammer so they can hear more about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Any other thoughts here on this episode or?
Nope, that was just my main takeaway is, like I said, that would be, if I had to come up with a theory and how everything's related and how everything's working together, that would be my number one go-to.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I don't mind that one at all, honestly. Of all of them, it's not the worst for sure. It's enjoyable.
All
But
right, well,
I
y'all have a
think
good night.
Greyways, yeah, you too, Purge. Thanks for calling in. All right. Well, we had a bunch of questions here, but I think if we go any more, I think it will all just start to blend and we won't even know what the fuck we're talking about anymore.
Such
Will
as
become the
warp
warp.
flickery.
Yeah,
Will
exactly.
become the war.
Phew. And you know, Ray has a little crackle in his voice. Every minute we carry on, he sounds more like a teenage boy, and we don't want to do that to him.
Wait till I shave.
Yeah, that is
No,
the
please,
best.
please.
There's a reason I keep this beautiful mane right here. So
Yeah, I can't give off the appearance of age through my maturity, so I have to do it through facial hair.
there we go.
Okay.
That's how dwarves do it.
That's how we do. I think let's all summarize what we kind of took away from this episode. For me, the big thing was just, I've said it now 5 times, was just the warp in fantasy is just so much more localized, and that's how I'm going to picture it from now on. Is just kind of yeah, so much more close, so much more personal, so much more intimate.
Yep. And while there's
In your ear.
you know, yeah, and while there's, you obviously point out a lot of similarities, and I do like it. Like I find it kind of fun when they make like the little inside joke of like that barely made reference to Khaldor Draco or or having the same chaos gods, or it's like those thinly veiled references to like there might be something else out there. But I do like what you have been pointing out, Marco. Like it can be two separate things. Like it doesn't have to be all interconnected like the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we touched on it real quick there. That was the big problem with AOS. Like if they came out with AOS as a completely different setting and didn't try to connect it, and even if the old world still ended in the end times and blew up, it's that those connecting lines that kind of make it funky and just like, what are you trying to get up to now? It's okay to have things different. Makes it awkward.
And then it's made even more awkward when you realize that like OG fantasy is actually back now, but it's all labeled as the old world.
It's a prequel.
Exactly. So you have 40K, you have Horus Heresy, which is basically 30K. You had fantasy. They got rid of it in the end times. As much as that sucked, don't ask Ray about the end times, dear listeners. Replaced it with AOS, but then they brought back old OG fantasy as the old world.
Yeah, what a clusterfuck.
Ray, what was your takeaway? For a second there. I'm sorry, I'm having flashbacks. Hang on, I'm just remembering the end times for a second. Give me a second to have this Vietnam flashback.
Ray, what happened in the end times?
I fucking hate the end times. Okay, regardless.
For those who are not watching, he's wiping tears away right now.
Sweating bullets.
So many good people away. I mean, they did. Everyone died. But I mean, I personally aspire to the theory that the warp is connected, but they don't have they're connected, but they don't need to make content. Like
sure.
Like the gods can be the same. Like Khorne can be there, Khorne can be over here, but you're not gonna have Space Marines invading Warhammer Fantasy. You're just not. Doesn't matter if the realms are connected, because the worlds are never gonna interact.
Sure.
So I'm fine with like both worlds being separate or connected in either way. I'm fine no matter which way they go.
Yeah, clearly you're an AOS player, even though they blew up old world. So
I say I'm an AOS.
You're just
player.
okay.
Fuck that.
You're okay with whatever.
I say I'm an AOS player.
Just because I have Stormcast models, I'm trying to make them cheap Custodes models. Okay, it's completely different. That's kit bashing and modeling purposes.
Honestly,
that's conversion opportunity.
Exactly.
Are you sure you're not an orc?
Whoa!
You're an orc. Every model is an orc model.
Yeah, even if it's not a part of either range. Cool. Well, let's get to the closing shoutouts here. I think this episode is going to be released on both our feeds, both Grimlore and the Lorehammer podcast. I think it's coming out first on Lorehammer's. On Grimlore. So you heard it here first on Grimlore. But just in case you heard this episode first on Lorehammer, do you guys want to shout out your podcast?
Sure. So for all the Lorehammer listeners out there, if you like what you hear, come join Ray and I over on the Grimlore podcast, where we talk about more of Warhammer Fantasy, a little bit of Age of Sigmar, and then really any kind of other grim and or dark setting as we feel like it, because we talk about Halo, Destiny. We had a recent bonus episode where a patron of ours talked about his own homebrew setting, and I think we got a couple others planned in the works. So yeah, come on over and listen to the fantasy side of things.
Have you ever thought about doing a trench war episode?
I think Trench
Crusade. Yeah, sorry.
I think one of our other patrons is going to be getting into that, so we'll let him take that over when the time comes.
I'm not feeling the urge to delve into Trench Crusade. Not like anything against it. I don't feel the need to invest into it.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in that same boat. Like I don't know anything about it except people like, if you don't like woke GW, go to Trench Crusade. I'm like, well, I still like GW, so I don't need no cheap knockoff. I got Warhammer Fantasy for that.
Uh-oh. Oh no. I
I've
don't know.
committed many
Do I-
hate
do I-
crimes.
Do I need to mediate between you two now?
Oh man.
Ooh,
So,
And,
Mark,
Yeah.
So, Mark, for our Grimlore listeners who have not heard of Lorehammer, how would you like to shout out your show?
Yeah, Lorehammer podcast. We talk all things 40K. We dive deep into many, many different topics. Gerald's one of my co-hosts, but I have many others as well. And doing it that way, we get so many different opinions and stuff. And I like to think I brought a couple unique things to this Grimlore episode, such as the call-in guest and the chat room on the side. But also, I like to think that maybe my notes were a little more structured, a little more thought out. But
yeah,
just kidding,
my
boys.
notes are very, very thought out. So they're definitely not just chicken scratch and some drawings of Marathi.
But you guys got the memes, and the memes are fun too. But yeah, Lorehammer podcast, come
Hey.
check us out. We're primarily a 40K podcast, although we do, do the odd kind of weird thing like this. So come check that out. And thank you guys so much for having me on your episode. It was a great time. And yeah, we'll definitely probably
Absolutely.
do some more crossovers in the future, or at least guest
Definitely.
appearances.
Oh, yeah, you're more than welcome. You're still one of our patrons. So, speaking of patrons, do you want to shout out any of your new Patreon members first?
I didn't put any into the notes of this episode. I've been doing back-to-back episodes, so it's only been like a couple hours since my last episode.
Oh, fair enough. You're busy. You're
Let's give him
a
a
busy
break.
boy.
Yeah,
Busy
so-
boy. So I guess before we finish this all out, let's us here at Grimlore thank our patrons. Let me get the list ready. The Honorable Grail Knight, Flub de Montfort, the Imperial Dwarven Knight, Astronautical, the Trickster Noble of Zinch Warper, the Noble Power Lifter of Nurgle, Big Joe G. Okay, hold on. Take a deep breath. The Noble Island Pirate Dwarf King Admiral Altair Warlord Exodite Replacer Cetro Lover, the Night Smoker, the Pipe Lead Electric Priest Boatmaster Founder James Complaints Part Man Part Fish Fan the Atomic Bongo Marquino Chicken Farmer Secret God Emperor Dad Hammer Storyteller Lover the Farmer's Wife Man the Machete Airbnb Host Crowlid Hunter.
Yeah, man of many titles. But yo, Gerald, I still have the art that you drew of my dwarven character for Grimlore. I love giving you guys some support. So thanks so much for the many, many titles. You guys truly honor me. Appreciate it.
Oh, I'm not even done. Crowlid Hunter, Magic the Builder, our Bodies Fanboy, Fisherman in Panama, Lorehammer Host, Listener, Lore, Spill Talker, Mark and B Host, Painter of the Dice, Collector Doors, Airborne, Lorehammer, Revised Lore, and Shrouded, He who reads the Lore, Canadian Panamanian, aka Trevor Bezak, and Father, Mark from Lorehammer.
Wow.
Whew.
Wow, I like Father the best, I think. The rest are nice, but Father. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, boys, what a fucking episode. I think we did it.
Wait, we still
How
got
do
some
we
more
close this
patrons. Hold
out?
on.
Oh,
the
sorry.
The Noble Scribes gave an exo flat call. The Wizard Noble Zinch Magnus the Rad. Oh yeah, the Druki Pirate King. We actually had a recent upgrade to Sigmar tier. Thank you, Dungledy Scalecock. The Noble Priestess Lanesha Zane Leopard. The Croxagor Knight of Corn Toasty, and the Errant Plague Knight de las Rosas. Okay, now we can finish everything out.
Love you guys.
Tight.
You guys are awesome.
Yeah, thanks for supporting everyone. All right. Well, great episode. We'll see you guys on the next one. Adios.
Have a good night.